And suddenly I'm watching this video of this guy with the VR headset on, and he's leading someone through the sinner's prayer. And I was like, whoa,
like, where
what
do I put this in my
is
mind?
happening?
Yeah.
I got to go to church with a bunny, a hot dog, and a mushroom. This was literally church for them, not a game. Christian ministries have been trying to prep for the future by finding ways to start using VR for discipleship and evangelism. I wanted to know if there are legitimate ministry opportunities in VR right now, or is this more of a flash in the pan sensation that won't be useful until, say, 10 years from now? To find out, I got together with Veer Kapoor from Renew's innovation team, and we visited 3 different churches that meet inside VR. The first VR church that we visited was a VR gathering for Lakeland Church in Wisconsin. Lakeland service gathers on a platform called Big Screen. Big Screen is like this virtual theater where you can get together with your friends or even random people and watch movies. The church service kind of reminded me of megachurches I've visited in Atlanta that simulcast the sermon to satellite campuses. A number of people came in during worship and they were greeted by Stu Nami, the pastor of the VR space. The message was great, and people who joined seemed engaged, even though Veer and I got slightly distracted by all the cool stuff that we could do in Big Screen. We threw darts, we threw popcorn, we drew 3D models of the planet Saturn in the air in front of us. But distractions aside, we really enjoyed the service. After church, we connected with Pastor Tsunami to ask him about his take on VR ministry.
I compare this to like a Catholic confessional. I can't see your face, you can't see mine. Yeah. I don't know you from Adam, you don't know me.
Yeah.
So most people who will pop in here that have questions about religion or faith, they come in here and they'll just word vomit all of their biases and questions and hurts and habits and hangups because they're not trying to save face. So in these spaces, it's actually a lot easier to do ministry.
Yeah.
Like reaching out to people and helping introduce them to Jesus is easier to do it in these spaces than it usually is in a physical space.
He also told us that we had to meet this guy named Cheddars. Veer and I took note of that, and we moved on to the next leg of our journey. The next church that we went to met inside this app called Rec Room. Rec Room is a social gaming app that's popular both on mobile and in VR. Instead of using the live stream model, this Rec Room church is entirely run within virtual reality. When we got there, a couple of volunteers came and gave announcements, and then people walked up to us and gave us a fist bump so that we could join up with them. This allowed them to take us into another space in Rec Room, the worship room. We all began in the middle of a dark forest at night, waist deep in a lake. Music was playing in the background, and people separated to go worship God in their own way. Seeing this guy fly by me like Superman belting out his own rendition of a Hillsong-style worship song was unexpectedly endearing. After worship, we were all taken to a field next to a building that was 1 Corinthians 14. You heard me correctly, the building was 1 Corinthians 14. Someone had built a 3D space with the text of the scriptures written on the walls of the building. To our surprise, the person leading the teaching was Cheddars, the guy that we were supposed to meet. He flew up in the air and began walking through the scriptures, asking different people to read a portion. So Cheddars did verse-by-verse expository preaching, and shockingly, everyone was glued to the message. This was literally church for them, not a game. At this point, Veer and I took a break to rest a bit before the final service. This last service was one that I was both looking forward to and a little bit nervous about. For those of you who haven't heard about VRChat, it's usually described by one word: chaotic. It's one of the strangest corners of the internet. I mean, imagine a bunch of bored, filterless 18-year-olds who enjoy talking to strangers online, and some of them are hot dogs. So Veer and I joined the church expecting disorder, and we found it to be shockingly engaged and respectful. It turns out that Cheddars was making a circuit that Sunday, and he preached at this service too, and he led everyone through the Bible, which was, again, written on this giant wall. I got to go to church with a bunny, a hot dog, this guy, whatever this is, and a mushroom. Everyone was super locked in and focused on the sermon, other than the mushroom guy. He was kind of spaced out. I expected VR to be a cool idea that might be useful at some point down the line. What I found was a real opportunity that's at our fingertips right now. I found myself dreaming about ways that I could get involved in VR ministry. Virtual reality is special. It opens up opportunities for personal connection and deep conversation among a post-Christian demographic that is often overlooked by the church. It could open up new doors to methods of discipleship that we've never dreamed could be possible. The potential is there right now, and we just need more people like Pastor Stunami and Cheddars who love Jesus, to step out and try something new. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Renew Show. I am Josiah, and I'm here with
Larissa,
Amanda.
And we today are going to talk about some crazy stuff with VR and how should the church respond? Should we engage with this? Is this something that we shouldn't do? And what are some of the pros and cons of engaging, especially Gen Z, in this new digital age when people are engaging with each other online in ways that they haven't before?
So can we talk a little bit about what you and Veer just experienced? Because I remember I was asking, like, what are you guys going to do this weekend? And you're like, oh yeah, Veer and I are going into 3 VR churches. And I was like, you're going into what?
So I want to say that was Veer's idea to do 3 in one day on a weekend. So like, I'm just like living my life, and Veer said, hey, do you want to like record some VR church stuff on the weekend? I was like, okay. And he said, yeah, so let's do it all day long. And so we literally would like charge the headset, put it on, go to a church. And if you guys haven't done VR before, it does hurt your eyes after a while. Like, because you remember when we were kids and your parents would tell you like, don't stand so close to the TV, you know, because it'll hurt your eyes. Literally, the screen is right here. You're literally as close to your TV as you possibly can get. And so we'd go and we'd join a church, and then we'd take a break. And so all day long we're doing this, but it was such a different experience than what I was expecting. Maybe, yeah, we can talk through.
So that was actually
things.
some of my question is how, so this is a church, it sounds like. I mean, it's set up like
Multiple
a church,
churches,
multiple churches.
Mm-hmm.
So how would you say it was really struck you as being different than like being in a regular church, but what was similar to being in like a healthy church?
So the first church that we went to reminded me so much of the church that Grandma and Grandpa used to go to in Athens, Georgia, which was like a church plant, I guess, from like Andy Stanley's church in Atlanta, where everyone would go and they would watch the pastor on a screen, but they're inside of a mega church. This was that, but in virtual reality, right? So the first church kind of had a similar dynamic, except that one of the guys in there, Pastor Stunami, who we interviewed, was, you know, like sort of their VR pastor. So if anyone came into the VR space, they could talk to him. And again, talking to someone in VR is pretty similar to talking to someone in real life. You see their expressions, you're kind of able to engage with them sort of on a pseudo face-to-face sort of setting. So that was that one church, very similar to what we do in kind of normal life.
What was interesting to me is it even set up that way.
Yeah.
Like the stadium seating.
Stadium seating, a big screen.
Like
The app is literally called Big Screen.
Yeah, like it looked like, you know, a church setting or like an amphitheater setting.
So that was the first one. The other 2 were interesting because they were more like attending a traditional church in the sense of you're not watching a real life person on a screen. The guy is actually an avatar there. In this case, doing expository, almost like Calvary Chapel style teaching, going line by line through scripture. In one case by flying around a building, another case by taking this giant, like, I think blue arrow and pointing at stuff on the wall.
Wasn't he super proud because he like made
Yeah, he was like,
arrow.
I modeled this myself. We're like, good job. An interesting thing though is Pastor Stunami, the pastor from the first church, you know, who was there in the church where we watched the screen. He has a second church that he's a part of where it's like more of a question and answer for the spiritually interested. So it's mostly unbelievers that join this church. And every week he has around 70 people who will come in and out at different times. And most of them are atheists. And so they come and they just talk about questions of faith, and they bring all of their questions. And sometimes he can't answer them. And he just says, I don't know, I'll research it and I'll let you know next week. And so he goes and he reads up on the questions they ask. He comes back and has conversation. And that's kind of the point that he brought up. A really interesting thing about doing church in the VR space is that, for one thing, there's this idea of the digital confessional, where people are more willing to say something a little bit shocking or to share something that feels personal to them. So if someone struggles with depression, they're more willing to say, I struggle with depression. What does Jesus have to say about that, right? If someone hates Christianity or has some major issue with the Bible, they're more apt to just straight up say it and then have a conversation about it than in real life where they wouldn't want to offend someone, because there's this separation of your digital characters that makes you feel safe. And so he's actually been able to use that for ministry, tapping into the realization that, man, all of these people who are in this space seem to be a lot more open to talking about spiritual things than if I just go out on the street and try to meet people.
You had mentioned one thing. You'd said everybody was really engaged. You gave like the two versions. There was that kind of psychedelic hallway where it just seemed like
You mean VRChat?
Yeah, people were going nuts. Like I was like, what is happening? And then there was inside of a different space, which was like the church space that you were just describing, where it seemed like everybody was relatively calm and not doing wild things.
Yeah, I have a question on that along the same lines. Like so one thing that's become very normal now is church over Zoom. Like that's become very accepted. So like, just tell us about the engagement side with people relating to each other, because both of those are digital, but what are like the differences?
So first, let me start with the point of like, what did it look like to see people engaged in VR? And then I'll hop on the Zoom question and how it's different. So VRChat is one of the most notorious, like not just places within like video games, but it's within like the internet. It's one of the strangest places. Like if you ever want to have just be really confused, just look up like VRChat videos on YouTube. And there's ones that like Travis is showing me that they're kind of shocking. Some of them you just don't watch, but like it's like,
maybe don't search
they'll have
that.
like hundreds of people will all put on the same avatar, and they'll show up and they'll only communicate with beeps and boops. So it's like 100 people just like beep, 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 boop, 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 boop. And you're like, what is happening? It's just super weird. So we went into that church expecting, a whole bunch of, like trolls, like people running around screaming and yelling obscenity and just trying to disrupt the service. And that was what I was expecting. And we show up and there's like, Mr. Hot Dog and this like bunny and this like random like Minecraft characters all just there just listening. And then he'd be like, does anyone want to read this next passage? And this like little crab would crawl up and be like, yeah, I'll read it. So the gifts of the Holy Spirit are given to those who, oops, I messed up that part. And you're like, is this real? Like, what am I watching? So I think our point about these people being so engaged was just that we were expecting chaos, like, kindergarten age, like Sunday school kind of stuff going on. But it was just, people were really respectful. They were listening, other than Mr. Mushroom, who's just like staring off into the distance. But I think that part of the reason why I found people so engaged is that when you think about the forms of digital church that we started doing in COVID, there's two primary ones, right? There's like YouTube church, which is what most churches did, where you stream a church service and then people just write in the chat their questions, or mostly just like, hi, hello, everyone. And that's about the full extent of their social interaction, is they're just writing in a chat. The step up from that is when churches would kind of form like these smaller groups of Zoom watch groups, sort of, where people would all get on a Zoom together, they watch something, talk about it, more like house church style. The downside of that model, though, is that you still can't just turn to someone and talk to them. You can't show up early and just have a conversation with one person. You can't hang out later and hear more about someone's life. It's kind of more like being in a classroom setting, right? Where the second the classroom is over, everyone disappears. But inside of VR, both in VRChat and honestly in all three of the churches we visited, you could walk up to someone afterwards and be like, hey, how did you meet the Lord? And just have a conversation with someone. You're watching their hands move around, you're hearing them talk, and then you could walk up to somebody else, or maybe a group of two people, and talk to them about something. And I realized from hearing from Stunami, they've been able to use that fact to do real discipleship, because they're able to have much deeper, what feels like face-to-face interactions with people in small group settings than you would be able to on Zoom or, on like a YouTube live stream.
So can I tell the story of someone we met that actually came to the Lord through VR Church?
Please. Well, before you go there though, let me just mention the first time I think we ever really got interested in VR was a friend of ours from YWAM, wasn't it?
Yeah. So I remember I was on Instagram and suddenly I'm watching this video of this guy standing in his living room with the VR headset on and the controllers, and he's leading someone through the sinner's prayer. And I was like, whoa.
You're like, where do I put this in my mind?
Happening? Yeah. Like, I have no grid for this. And so that was the first time that you too, right? Was that your first time hearing
first time
about
I
that?
ever
Yeah.
saw someone doing real ministry in a VR context.
Yes. And so the awesome thing was that this year we got to actually meet someone who came to the Lord through like in virtual reality. So we met this guy named Stuart, and his story is, it's pretty intense. He went through a long season of his life where he was in just a really, really dark place. He was very depressed, like suicidal, and he started escaping his life and going into virtual reality.
That same app, VRChat.
Yes,
same
VRChat.
place that third, church
Yes.
we visited.
Yeah, so he was spending his time in VRChat and for hours upon hours upon hours daily. And he got to a point where he was like, I cannot keep living like this. My life is in total shambles. I have to escape my life and go into VR. He had grown up as a Christian, like in a church. He had grown up in a church, and he was like, wait a second, maybe I should go to a church to get my life straightened out.
But instead of going to a physical church on the corner, the place where he lived was basically
'cause that
VR.
was like his
so he decided to go to
world.
church in his environment, which was VRChat.
The part that's also crazy about this story is he literally said, even though I grew up in church, I never really understood the gospel or God. That's
and hadn't prayed
crazy
before
to me.
too. Yeah.
Yeah. And so for the first time inside of this space, he's praying, going to a
So
church.
he finds a church
Yeah.
in virtual reality.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then ends up giving his life to the Lord.
Mhm.
And then he's faced with this, like his whole life is turned around. He's not depressed anymore. He got set free from being like in that deep, deep darkness. And then he was like, wait a second, there are so many people who are in the same exact place where I was in that terrible darkness. And I went to go reach those people. And so now the amazing thing is he's actually a full-time staff with Crew?
He's transitioning into currently being full-time with Crew.
Yes, going into VR specifically to reach the lost. And so one of the stories that we heard from him was wild, where it blew my mind, kind of like that initial video of the guy standing in his living room praying the sinner's prayer with someone. But he said, so Stuart was telling you the story, and he said that he was in VRChat, and there's this one character there, and his avatar was Darth Vader, but he was known for being the Darth Vader in that area. And so everyone knew who he was, and the guy always used this voice distortion, so he sounded like Darth Vader. It's his whole persona. Yeah. So he ended up talking to this guy about the Lord, but then they had a private meeting together in VRChat, and the guy turned off his voice distortion
and just talks about life, all the things he's been going through.
But he never, that's his whole thing. He does not, in the
he doesn't
TV
break
show,
character.
The Mandalorian, he doesn't take his helmet off. This guy doesn't turn off his voice. But he ended up giving his life to the Lord.
Wow.
And so he's been, getting discipled. So that was one thing where I was like, what on earth is happening in there?
Okay, so let's clarify.
There's a lot of work to do
there's
there.
a lot. Yeah, there's a lot of unpacking. And also, I just want to say, the highlight for me about that is you're starting to creep in with that story. You're starting to creep into some of the possibilities of VR with being able to actually get discipled and have a relationship. And that for me is super exciting. Confessional for myself, okay? Because I did not know what VR is. So if you feel that way, don't be ashamed. Because I was getting all confused. I was like, so the they're like, no. I'm like, no. So let's just clarify a few terms.
Sure.
When you say, let's start at metaverse.
Okay.
What is...
And what is it not?
What is it not?
Yeah. What is the metaverse?
The metaverse is a marketing term that doesn't really mean anything.
Okay.
There were some famous novels that came out years ago that presented this kind of idea where the internet was more of a video game, where the whole internet got moved into sort of a digital space where people would walk around and live a second life, basically. And that was what Facebook really has wanted to make a thing. But it either feels like society isn't ready for that, or no one really wants that.
It didn't take off.
That didn't
We're
take
not
off.
seeing the realities of
The
that.
concept of the metaverse and NFTs and all this stuff kind of just has more or less died out in the past 2 years. So that is more of a marketing term. When we talk about VR, here's what we're talking about. there's this super category of video game platforms and video game software, right? And that goes all the way back to the Atari and Super Mario and all this stuff. Underneath that category, there is a type of video game that involves a VR headset, which is just a more engaging video game. The opportunities that this presents is just that a lot of these platforms tend to be more social than video game platforms have traditionally been, because they are by nature a bit more immersive.
Well,
so
because
it's just a
that
more immersive video game, basically.
Yeah, but the headset, I think, is like the key term. So like when we're talking VR, we're talking about that headset that comes with the little
controllers.
Controllers that you're able to use that as a way of interacting, but also there's like built-in microphones as well as speakers. So it's vibrating. You're hearing like the space around you, people talking, and you're able to interact.
Yeah, what happened when the first times where it like really clicked for you?
My gosh. Yeah, so there was this game we were talking recently about how my dad is kind of a futurist. So whenever there's something new,
let's have So
he lives like
So hold on. Wait. So we get this headset. I don't know who bought it. Probably you,
my dad,
or Veer.
Me and my
Before
dad.
it had really taken off, and so like none of us had tried it out yet.
And again,
So
we all
VR.
work at Renew, this ministry that my dad founded. And Renew, part of our culture though, is just trying new things and being excited about new opportunities, right?
Yes.
So he got really excited about VR.
Yeah, to the point where we were gonna do tours of VR and we were gonna do everything, which TBD, okay? But he gets this headset, and I just remember one day walking downstairs into like, we have this open space in Renew, like the court area or whatever. And I remember walking downstairs at the end of the day, nobody's really in the building, and your dad is just wandering. Like he is all over the place. And I remember like stopping at the front door, looking at him, and then just kind of trying to walk around him because he was a little reckless.
But then what did he do? Because normally you like make boundaries so that you don't walk into a wall, like it'll shut off. So,
it has a special thing to prevent you from walking into a wall, but he shut it off so he could just wander the whole building. I don't know how he was doing that without like getting a concussion. Anyways, when he did that, he let me borrow it. I downloaded this game that was it was like a spin-off of this novel called Ender's Game, where you're basically in this game playing like ultimate frisbee sort of, but inside of zero gravity. So you feel like you're in the space station, right? You can push off the walls and you can fly with jets, and it's super fun. And so I'm playing this game, and it's cool, but it's still just kind of like a video game. I'm like, oh, this is an interesting thing. But a thing about the game that was different is because you're holding these controllers where your hands are tracked, when you move your hands, they move in front of you. Wow. You know, like if I go like this, I can watch like my fingers go up, my fingers go down. And that was the first thing that was kind of freaky, where I was like, man, this feels unlike any game I've ever played. But the moment that kind of freaked me out was I remember I was at the like starting line where you get, sent into the game to play against a team. And one of my teammates comes up next to me and grabs onto the wall. And I look over at him, and he's like a robot avatar with, arms like a human. And he looks over at me and he waves at me, and his eyebrows go up, and I wave back at him. And I felt this like wave of mixture of like, I can't even describe the feeling, but my brain told me, this is a human and you're a robot. Basically, like it was this really shocking feeling, because when you're in a video game, you have a little character that's moving around and other people moving around. It's a person on the other side of the world who's playing. But actually seeing a person wave at you and being able to wave back to them was just like
in
bizarre.
In real time
while they're playing somewhere else in the world. So what we're kind of seeing is that there's this quote from the founder, or I guess the president right now of OpenAI, where he said that video games, as we know them now, are going to become unimaginably better in the future because of the way that technology and AI are advancing so quickly. They're starting to replicate the way that we experience real life, which opens up interesting opportunities to be able to reach people at their heart level, because it's a closer connection than they would have over a video call or over something different. It obviously comes with an enormous number of dangers and pitfalls too, which we'll probably talk about.
Yeah.
But anyways, there's some cool opportunities.
I do want to talk about the opportunities, because I do think that one thing that we talked about that I think is really important just to highlight inside of this, and you kind of are talking through it a little bit, it's just like the natural fears, but some of that has to just do with this global youth culture that we are seeing, and the types of things that are a part of it.
Yeah.
And why grabbing a hold of these type of opportunities can't be fear-based.
Yeah.
They can't be decisions based off of maybe some of the limited information that we have about it, but really do warrant just at the very least exploring it.
Yes.
Because, and this is, I would say, probably the part that pulls at my heart the most, like technology for technology's sake is ridiculous. Like, who cares about it? But technology, as you're describing VR, as you're describing this world where people are having their social interactions, becomes all of a sudden
gateway to the people
exactly
who need Jesus.
Exactly. And so I want to just unpack like the amount of people that are in this space, and I also just want to unpack like global youth culture, some of the things that
have shifted.
Shifted, and why this becomes a viable opportunity. Because I can imagine people listening, even after we described what VR is, and even after we started to, it all kind of still sounds, and it's a little
speculative.
Yeah, it's super speculative. And I don't think at all what we are attempting to do is to somehow say that this is a viable option, but by presenting stories and testimonies.
The truth is we don't really know for sure yet, but there's like this point where
it's important to investigate. So let's talk a little bit about global youth culture. You guys had a recent trip that helped to explain a little bit of what you found as far as like it just being common that people are engaging in.
Really quick, Amanda, when we went over to Central Asia, what was the one thing that shocked you about the young people when we were there?
So we were going to be with the underground church in Central Asia with like over or roughly 2,000 young people from that area.
Highly persecuted.
And so in my mind, I had this idea of what they would look like, what it would look like. And I walk into this room and there's loud blasting music. There are these kids with their phones out going live on social media. Crazy. And they're all dressed way cooler than we are. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is not what I was expecting. And the part that struck me was how similar they were in culture in a way to my cousins at home that are the same age. And I realized that even though their culture is very different because they're in Central Asia, we're in the United States, there's something with the connectedness of being online where there's TikTok videos that are actually setting trends, setting culture, and it's
everywhere at
once.
Yeah.
And so there's this like below a certain age, there are all of these young people, as long as they are online, they're like getting sucked up into that culture.
And here are the implications for that within the video game space and the VR space. Is when you guys think of video games when you were a kid, Amanda, what do you think of?
Donkey Kong on our
Donkey Kong Country on the Game Boy Advance. Best game ever. I'll stand by that. Larissa, what do you think of?
I go from Atari.
Okay. That's a little bit before my time.
It's before your time. I go Atari. I go the original Genesis, and then I go to Sega.
So here's the crazy thing that happened is with kind of the rise of multiplayer online games and World of Warcraft and a lot of gaming platforms around the time of the internet and then eventually social media, games became inherently much more social than they had been before. At the same time, social media starts taking off, which is also online and also more social, at least scratching some of the itches that we have for social interaction. The crazy thing is this entirely rewired the development and the brains of Gen Z. There's a book about it called The Anxious Generation, about how girls have gotten sucked into social media and boys have gotten sucked into video games, and how it's changed the way they interact with the rest of the world. And so when we're looking at reaching society right now, Gen Z thinks differently and they interact with people differently than they used to. And so when we're talking about how can, VR be used for the kingdom of God? How can video games be used for the kingdom of God? It's actually saying the generation that's living right now interacts through screens. This is the way they communicate with people. And in many cases, they have not learned how to do it in real life. Most of their realest moments with their friends happen digitally. And this is provable that this shift has happened. And So when we're looking at it, it's not just like, oh, cool new technology. How can we use that for the glory of God?
Actually
It's saying
shifting
something
culture.
changed.
Yeah.
And how can we make sure that we don't miss an entire decade or more of people checking out from spiritual things because we have stayed the same while the way that they interact with other people has shifted?
Yeah. And I think one of the things we've recently had a conversation with a friend of ours, Liam Savage over at One Hope, and he's got a course on innovation. He's
and a long history with that.
a long history
Great
with
guy.
it. But one of the things that he says, and I know you've said it quite a few times, is like we actually can't afford
To
as
not
a
innovate.
church, as believers, to not innovate.
Yeah, he said it's riskier to not innovate.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of what he's getting at is, again, going back to like the main point of it. It's like when you are held back by fear and you're not willing to just think through new ideas, it's not just that you miss new ideas, you miss people.
Yeah.
And you miss, unfortunately, you start missing a generation.
Yeah.
And so
you lose opportunities altogether. You're not just getting behind, but you can also totally miss an opportunity.
I don't remember, one of you guys, I feel like, said something about like being relevant is different than being.
Yeah, I saw maybe we'll put some kudos to whoever said this,
Yeah,
but being relevant and being cool aren't the same thing.
Exactly.
That it's to be relevant means that you're actually able to speak to people where they're at. And something that I think the Apostle Paul was so good at. But when we're talking about this space of the need for innovation, I think my favorite quote is the best time to plant a tree is 20 years ago. And as the church, we can oftentimes want to say, oh, what's the thing right now that's really effective?
Right.
Like, and I think right now it's probably social media if you're thinking in the digital space.
Or like, what are the young people into?
What are the young people into? What's the thing
cool
right now? But the challenge with that mindset is, as the church, we end up missing opportunities to long-term impact people for the gospel. Because if you really want to be able to effectively use technology, you have to start experimenting with it in the early phases. This doesn't mean that you dump all of your energy into it or you spend a bunch of money.
Because some stuff won't work it won't be the answer.
VR has had years of trying to take off for actually decades, and it really hasn't hit like that fever pitch culture change. Everyone's using it. There are literally hundreds of millions of users now. It's pushing into about 200 million users globally. But, cell phones there's like 10 billion cell phones in the world.
Right.
And in social media has almost hit those numbers also. So it's still in that speculation kind of space. But like Liam said, if we are afraid to innovate right now and we want to protect what we have, we end up actually missing out on opportunities to reach people. So I think that we can get confused. What were we talking about earlier? I think that there's a difference between the core of the gospel and the mediums to deliver that core of the gospel.
Yeah.
Was that kind of what we were saying?
Yeah, there's something that we've been probably since the pandemic, like in the middle of the pandemic, when everybody was rethinking how they were doing everything. And one of the things that your dad kept saying is old things, new ways.
Yeah.
And so it's not throwing away the foundations of our faith and our spiritual practices, evangelism and discipleship and healthy community and reading your word,
accountability,
accountability, and all
iron
the things.
Sharpens iron.
All the things that we know are needed for healthy spiritual growth. So it's not doing away with that, but it is looking at how can those same things exist inside of something new and inside of a new space. And so I think what we're really saying about this particular subject is, what does that look like inside of VR? And one of the things I think that really surprised me was, the fact that this could happen. Yeah. Those things could actually happen. Like, I was a little skeptical, honestly, until you guys started talking
old
about
things like discipleship and evangelism and real friendship.
And they're not, when we say old things, it's not old as in like not relevant. It's old as in like the foundational things, right? The core things. But I was skeptical until I realized like, oh, what has shifted inside of gaming and technology and VR and these things that we're talking about is that you actually can have this level of interaction and community. And so I would say one of the things that I've been really interested in is it kind of shifted my mind to say, man, what would it look like if a local pastor or a local youth pastor would see that person who's maybe spending maybe inappropriate time on
Yeah.
video games or
Yeah.
or maybe just really interested in them in
Yeah.
the same way that we maybe notice that, man, you're really artistically inclined. Have you considered doing this? Or you're really musically inclined. Have
Yeah.
you considered doing this? What might it look like if somebody in a local church context would see that in a young guy, young girl, and say, man, what would it look like if I discipled you to disciple others inside of that
Well,
space?
I know, like when Amanda and I went to a youth group when we were in college, and I had led worship at house churches and stuff like that. But the reason I got into leading worship was because my pastor, the young youth pastor guy, was like, hey, he's a really strong guy and kind of talks like this and talks really fast. He was like, hey, when we do the when we're like passing the plate around for giving time, can you like play a song or something? I heard that you play songs. Can you do that? And I was like, oh, and it was a little scary because I hadn't done that in front of more than 20 people. But that was actually what launched me into getting really involved in music and songwriting and championing artists and all that stuff. I needed someone who had context to be able to say, oh, can you use that for the glory of God? And so I think as pastors and leaders, there's an opportunity to see people who care about these digital spaces or are interested in them and say, can you use that for the glory of God? And be the ones to show the examples of how people are engaging culture through these different mediums and bringing the kingdom of God to places where it often isn't. Yeah.
There's a time in history, I think, that you guys were just kind of mentioning, and I think we are all really thankful that it didn't continue that way, when the idea of bringing people the gospel or giving them the Bible looked like everybody needs to learn English.
Because that's the language that the Bible is in. It's in English.
So there was this idea that the Bible's in just a few languages. So what we're going to do is take people, change them to be more like us so they can understand like the way that we study scripture. And the massive shift that's happened in the church globally is people saying, wait a minute, instead of me changing you to be like me so you can do church my way, why can't I actually translate the Bible into your language? And then you can find your structures of how you do church based on the way that you interpret the New Testament, right?
And there's just so many similarities with that and with this younger generation too, where even though the older people and the younger people could all be part of the same culture, there are like marked differences, and it's okay to enter into someone else's culture. There's good things in every culture. There's of course things that need to change.
But things that
really need to change, but there are things that are good.
That's right.
Yeah.
So here's how I think maybe we can start to end and wind down. There's a place in scripture where Jesus says that the scholars of the kingdom will bring out of the storehouse that which is old and that which is new. And part of the way that I interpret that is when Jesus talks about new wine and all of this stuff, that there are old things that are good. They're holy. There's so many amazing things that God has given us, some that came through tradition, some that came from scripture and from God himself, and they're good things. But the scholars of the kingdom will also bring out that which is new. And so there's this constant, beautiful, creative process where we have a hopeful curiosity about things like VR, about things like these new digital spaces. And instead of trying to think only about the negatives, we also think, what about the positives? What about the people who are behind these screens?
Yeah.
So anyways, here we are.
Yeah.
Thanks for joining us today on this adventure.
Yeah. Goodbye, guys. We hope that you join us again soon. And thank you so much for listening.
Bye.
Take care.